I will forget. Okay. Thanks all for being here. This is our first virtual book talk for this academic year, 2024-2025. I'm Stephanie Canizales. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at UC Berkeley and the incoming faculty director of the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative. This book talk series is jointly organized by 3 migration studies centers affiliated with the University of California, BIMI here at Berkeley, the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration, directed by Roger Waldinger, and the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego, directed by Abigail Andrews. We are so incredibly grateful and thrilled to welcome Dr. Blair Sackett as our first book talk speaker. When I extended the invitation to Dr. Sackett a few months ago, I told her I have not written a single thing since reading this book last fall. I haven't cited. We thought it would be heaven. And so I'm so grateful that you accepted our invitation and are joining us today. For some quick introductions, Dr. Blair Sackett is a research fellow at the Immigration Lab at American University. Her work focuses on the intersection of social inequality and forced migration. She's conducted research in the US and Kenya, examining how policies and programs shape refugee families' access to rights and resources. She's the lead author of the book, We Thought It Would Be Heaven, Refugees in an Unequal America, published with the University of California Press, alongside Annette Lareau on the obstacles that refugee families face in the US. Blair holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. We are also so honored to be joined by the Dr. Helen Morrow here from Tufts University. We're so grateful to be joined by a sociologist of immigration, race, ethnicity, social class, health, inequality, and social policy. Her work explores Latin Americans' incorporation trajectories and racial and ethnic identities in the US and Europe, the impact of immigration on social life and race relations in the rural American South, variation in public bureaucracy's approaches to unauthorized immigrants, the relationship between immigrant-host contact, threat, trust, and civic engagement, and Americans' immigration aspirations. As associate professor of sociology at Tufts University, she teaches across Introduction to Social research methods and various courses in immigration, race, ethnicity, and Latinos in the US. We are planning for about a 40-minute book talk with Dr. Sackett, maybe 10 or 15 minutes of comments from Dr. Morrow, and then a Q&A that will open up to the audience. Just as a reminder, we are recording, and if you would like to stay off of the sort of video part of the recording, please make sure to keep your camera off. I think I covered all our bases. I'll hand it off to Dr. Sackett. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. And Helen, I'm looking forward to hearing your comments as well, and everybody else. I'm just going to take a minute and share my screen here.
Yeah, I can see.
Okay, let's see. Can you see my screen okay? No notes.
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you again for having me today and for organizing this amazing panel. As Stephanie mentioned, I'll be talking about my findings from my book with Annette Lareau. We Thought It Would Be Heaven, Refugees in an Unequal America. Okay. So after fleeing their homes and spending years and often decades living in limbo in refugee camps, the families that we got to know reported that they had high hopes for when they received word that they had been selected for resettlement to the US. Indeed, they consider themselves to be among the lucky few. Less than 1% of the world's refugees receive resettlement. And so they knew that this was, they felt it was a privileged opportunity. They hoped for a better life, and some reported to us that We even thought it would be heaven. After years of hardship, they felt and hoped that they had found a place of refuge and that their life would be better, both for them and their children. However, while they hoped that the US would be a land of opportunity, upon arrival, they quickly found it was also a land of inequality. Inequalities by race, class, gender, legal status. And so in this talk, based on our book, I'm going to draw on the experiences of these recently resettled refugee families coming from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And in showing you their experiences, seek to shine a light on the institutional obstacles that they faced upon resettlement to the US and how these obstacles blocked their socioeconomic mobility, a key marker of incorporation, and the challenges they faced in accessing resources and getting ahead. So, of course, there's a large literature on how refugees and immigrants do once they arrive to the US, including from many of the wonderful folks here today. From this, we know that when refugees and immigrants arrive, features of the receiving society or the context of reception really matter for their processes of incorporation. So within this reception, US institutions play a key role. Scholars have shown how on the one hand, they can facilitate assimilation. In fact, even among those who face legal barriers, different institutions and organizations can be a form of bureaucratic incorporation, as Helen Morrow has shown us. And so we've seen they can both facilitate and block assimilation and incorporation. In particular, refugees are seen as a distinctive group of migrants. They have a distinctive path of migration rather than necessarily self-selecting. Refugees who are resettled are selected by UN institutions and other partnering organizations in a third country. In the case of many of the families we talked to, they were based in Uganda or Burundi, where they had originally sought asylum before coming to the US. Their case is then selected, and the US government approves their case for migration. Once their case is approved, they receive support from the government and other refugee resettlement agencies in their migration pathway. Once they arrive, refugees receive a very sort of this web of institutional support, leading scholars to theorize that maybe they have a favorable context of reception. Indeed, when refugees arrive, they receive assistance from the Federal Refugee Resettlement Program. This includes housing, basic furnishings when they arrive. There are maybe an apartment set up for their family with some real basics like forks or a couch, a certain number of beds for each family member. And crucially, they receive assistance from caseworkers and sometimes volunteers. Additionally, refugees are unique in having access to the US social safety net. So this includes food stamps, welfare assistance, that sort of social safety net. However, this program is also set up with the expectation that refugees will be self-sufficient within 90 days. This is in sort of previous decades, support lasted much longer, sometimes for up to 3 years. So in recent decades, this support has decreased. And we've also seen, of course, decreases in the US social safety net. Moreover, we know that while having access to resources and services, a sort of web of social support, can be beneficial, we know from research with Native-born Americans, for instance, that navigating and actually accessing these resources can be quite costly and challenging. Accessing support often assumes knowledge, often cultural knowledge about different organizations and institutions and different requirements to access those resources. These costs are not neutral. Scholars have shown that they're racialized and unequal in the way they're distributed. Additionally, we know that families often navigate many institutions all at once. And so, in understanding both how refugees and newcomers access resources, it's important not to just to look at one institution in a silo, such as education and outcomes in an educational context, but also understand how families are juggling many different institutions all at once. So for families, they're not just navigating a school system, but also might be navigating paying bills, utility bills, or navigating a green card application. And so in understanding the obstacles that refugees and other newcomers face, it's really important that we look not just at this one institution, but at their experiences across institutions and how they manage all of these processes at once. So just to preview the argument of the book and this talk, we found that across the newcomer Congolese families we talked to faced three kinds of obstacles across these different kinds of organizations and institutions. As newly arrived families, set up shop and sought out educational benefits, schools. In each institution, they faced hurdles. These were routine rules and requirements that they had to meet to actually access resources. With so much complexity, these processes could snag, becoming a knot when an error happened and a tangle in bureaucratic procedures happened. These knots could halt access to resources. Additionally, because families were navigating so many different organizations and institutions at once, problems in one could reverberate, spreading to another institution. So a problem in a school could end up creating a problem with child protective services or in healthcare. These kinds of obstacles, again, were across organizations and blocked access to resources that were crucial for families in terms of their socioeconomic mobility. We also found that some families were able to overcome these obstacles and often drew on key resources, both in terms of different actors and systems and in terms of programs. So families were able to overcome obstacles with help from cultural brokers. These were people outside of the family sometimes and outside of the organizations that could bridge the family, helping to overcome different hurdles and knots, stopping reverberations from happening. We also saw that institutional insiders, so employees within organizations, a teacher within a school, or a nurse in a medical setting, could help untie and prevent these obstacles, overcoming barriers. We also saw that this kind of assistance was especially likely in well-resourced programs where actors had more resources to take attention, to make sure processes were streamlined and to correct errors. By overcoming these obstacles, families who were able to do that accessed key resources and achieved markers of socioeconomic mobility, sending their children to college, buying homes, increasing their economic savings. So these obstacles and resources were really key. Our research is based on in-depth research with 44 refugee families from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Since 2016, Congolese have been the largest nationality group who have received resettlement. I spent I did in-depth ethnographic observations and home visits with four Congolese refugees who had recently arrived to Philadelphia. I originally met the families through an English as a second language learning course. I volunteered at the course. I got to know the families through the different classes. And then once we built up a relationship and rapport, I asked them if I might be able to visit them at their home, to spend time with them, to learn more about both the challenges they were having and the successes in their new life in the US. All four families agreed. And then I met with them often weekly for about a year, year and a half. About 5 years later, I conducted in-depth follow-up interviews to see how they were doing, how many of those early experiences had impacted their later sort of trajectory. Most of this research was done in Swahili, which I have advanced language skills in. In addition, we triangulated this ethnographic observations with sort of these four more intensive families with a broader group of 40 Congolese families, and we selected families from across the US. I'd be happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. Much of that work was done during COVID, and so we did much of the interviews over the phone or on Zoom. And we worked together with a research team that included three Kenyan RAs who were undergrads at Penn and spoke Swahili as well. That brought up some really interesting questions about positionality and allowed us to really think critically about how positionality mattered in the research process. So again, that's something we can talk about in the Q&A. Additionally, I did interviews with aid workers and volunteers to understand their experiences as well. So based on this research, we found that many of the families, while they were entitled to receive a range of services across institutions, they faced institutional hurdles. These were routine rules and requirements that must be met to receive services. These sometimes included very routine things like filling out forms for heating assistance or a field trip or summer program for their children's school. Calling to schedule a doctor's appointment or even using an online portal to pull up bills or a schedule, messages back and forth with doctor's appointments and medical professionals. Hard cut requirements for SNAP or food stamp assistance. So many of these things were seemingly small obstacles that for some would in fact be small or easy to overcome. But particularly for newcomers, such as refugees who might not speak the language and were new to our US social systems, they might not have the cultural institutional know-how of how these systems worked. These seemingly small things could become really big things. One signature could halt access to resources. These were often intended to prove eligibility or sort of a deservingness to resources. And this is something that has really proliferated in a lot of US institutions, these requirements to show deservingness, a strict scrutiny of eligibility, particularly in recent years, sort of under ideology of rooting out fraud, but scholars have also shown as associated with a shrinking social safety net. Again, these were not neutral, these little rules and hurdles, but rather were rooted in larger structures of classism, racism, and sexism. Okay, so for instance, Malu and Mari were a Congolese family with 8 children. They arrived in Philadelphia with high hopes that they would reach a better life. Malu had a disability and his leg had been amputated right below the hip on the right side. Mari, therefore, got a job upon their arrival in a vegetable packing factory. Meanwhile, Malu stayed home with the children. Sivi, their 4-year-old, and their two 18-month-old twins. So he watched them while the other children were at school and while Mari was at work. Through Mari's job at the vegetable packing plant, Sivi was eligible for an early Head Start program, a key educational benefit. However, for months, nobody told Mari and Malu that this was a possible benefit. The family arrived in Philadelphia in the blazing heat of July. Mari started her job before the leaves started to turn in September. Unaware of the educational program, they didn't pursue it. No one came to enroll Sivi, and it wasn't until January, a full semester later, halfway through the school year, that Nevin, who worked for the Pennsylvania Migrant Department, turned up at the house. So even once they started the process for enrollment, once Nevin told them about the program, there was a really long, hefty application process that involved countless hurdles to actually access the program. Nevin played a key role in helping to shepherd this, but it included a range of medical records, vaccination records, dental records, and proof of residency. Nevin explained to me, it can take the organizations a really long time to give some of this necessary paperwork. Like they might respond in a month. So he had been working on the back end to gather all of this paperwork and overcome these different hurdles. However, the last remaining piece was he needed a sort of proof of residency from the family, a sort of official form that the family lived at the apartment they said they did, and this was specifically on a piece of mail. As Nevin explained, I have to fill out this form and I need him to give me mail addressed to him with his current address to verify his residency. So one day I was sitting there as Nevin was there and he was negotiating this back and forth with Malu. Malu had already walked up the stairs, hobbling on his crutches, come back with a piece of mail and said, is this it? And I'm sort of translating in Swahili back and forth. So Nevin holds this up and he says, it's an electricity bill, but it's in somebody else's name. So each piece of evidence for this form had to be a specific form, right? It couldn't be any piece of mail. It had to have their address. It had to be a specific kind. Malu goes back up, he gets another piece of mail and brings it back down. This time it's sort of a advertisement or a kind of junk mail. It has the family's name, but it's not official enough. So Nevin sends him back up. Eventually, after going back and forth, they find a piece of mail that works. So you can see just accessing this one benefit, there's countless hurdles. So these hurdles caused a delay, and this delay was costly and consequential. So for the family, even once they fulfilled all of these requirements, Nevin had bad news. So once the approval was made, he said, unfortunately, the closest early Head Start program, which is right down the street, is already full. So this closest opening was about a mile from the apartment. For some, that might have been fine, but the journey to get there was along bumpy sidewalks and across a really busy sort of highway street. Given Malu's limited mobility, his leg was amputated, the delay in enrollment and the resulting lack of spots was a major setback. He was just unable, as he explained to Nevin, to manage the 18-month-old twins and to walk Sivi a mile to that location. So for the family, the distance was a deal breaker. Malu takes a breath and responds assertively to Nevin. We want Sivi to go to school and we want her to start now, but I don't know if I'll be able to take her. Nevin cautions, he doesn't know if there's another program. This is kind of it. Can they make it? And when Malu hesitates, he says, well, I guess you can just wait until September. the next school year and hope for better next year. So again, you see hurdles caused a delay, and in the end, this blocked up to a year of crucial early education for Civi. This was a service they were eligible for, but unable to access. So we saw these hurdles blocking resources across a wide range of institutions, and across all of the families we talked to, from education, housing, healthcare. And each of these hurdles, not only did it block resources, but it also created complexity and more opportunity for errors and things to go wrong. Indeed, while sometimes routine institutional processes moved smoothly, and despite costs, hurdles were overcome, sometimes things went wrong. In fact, frequently things went wrong. Officials made mistakes, documents were lost in the mail, and sometimes refugee families or the volunteers or others helping them made a misstep. They took the wrong bus, missed an appointment, filled out a form incorrectly, missed a key signature. Key infrastructure faltered, a bus was running late, a computer system jammed. There were countless things that could go wrong. So we found that these little errors tangled procedures, and then these tangles blocked access to social services. Untangling these knots required a lot of time and effort, including new institutional procedures. These demanded additional institutional know-how and knowledge, and they were often extremely stressful for the families. For instance, having fled the Second Congo War and eking by to make ends meet in the refugee camp in Uganda, Honorea Kimenyuera faced new obstacles when she arrived in Philadelphia with her 5 children. She had high hopes for life in Philly, but this all came to a halt about 6 months after she arrived. In a mishap, her children were taken away by Child Protective Services, CPS, and Honorea stressed it was bad. It was really bad. So this knot first occurred one afternoon in mid-January. Honorea walked to the grocery store, and without access to childcare in the US, she left all of her children at home supervised by Peter, her 12-year-old son. Indeed, in the refugee camp, it was very common for children to run around with independence, and any adult who was in the area could keep an eye on them. It wasn't necessary to have sort of a formal adult supervision. It was more community-based. In the US, of course, we have different sort of rules and expectations about child supervision. While Honorea was gone, Daoudi, who was 2 years old, slipped out of the house. The police found him running around outdoors by himself without a coat. When they took him back to Honorea's apartment, they identified that there was no adult home to supervise the children. So here, Honorea hadn't crossed that expectation or requirement. So once they arrived at the house, they also discovered that the heat wasn't turned on in the apartment, and the apartment was cold. So Honorea didn't have a job. In fact, her caseworker had encouraged her to wait until Daoudi was in school because it just wasn't financially viable. She wouldn't make enough money to pay for childcare. So to get by, she was really scrimping on cutting costs wherever she could. So she didn't turn the heat on and they bundled up. However, again, this is a requirement in the US that you have a safe housing environment, including heat in the winter. So this was another hurdle the police deemed unmet. When Honorea returned home later, she found the apartment empty. She didn't know what happened or where her children were. Later, the police returned and tried to talk with her. Eventually, she found out that they had taken the children when she hadn't met those expectations. The police asked her for the children's name and to sign some documents. Unable to speak English and extremely stressed and upset about the situation and where her children had been, she just signed the documents. Whatever they said, she hoped doing that would bring her children back. In the meantime, she called her caseworker, Zeus, and he rushed to the apartment. By the time he arrived, however, she'd already signed the papers, and it turned out signing these documents meant that she was turning her children over to foster care. Honoria stayed at home, anguishing. Each long day stretched into the next, and as she waited, unable to sleep or eat. In an interview with me, she anguished. You grow children in your stomach. Children need their mother. All the time in Africa, and the children were always with me. I should have never left the refugee camp. So finally, after 2 weeks, her nightmare was over. But as she put it, it took a really long time. So untying this knot with CPS required new institutional processes. She had to navigate the police, the family court system. They had to fill out countless documents appealing this decision. And so Zeus helped her along the way, but untying this knot was very costly. It was hard on her, was stressful and time consuming. So even though it was eventually overcome, it was very challenging for the family. Plus, untying the knot just meant they were back where they started. It wasn't that they had exerted a lot of effort and she had made new gains. It was rather that she ended up back with her kids at home, just as they had started. Additionally, at times, institutional obstacles could reverberate from one sort of institutional field or type of organization, creating new unrelated problems in other institutions, right? Because a family was navigating many processes in many institutions at once. This was sort of like a ripple effect where reverberations spread across organizations. So for Honoria, for instance, even though she got her children back, the CPS case threatened to reverberate, creating these new unrelated problems. So first, Honoria fretted that the CPS case would affect her ability to get a green card. At the end of her first year, indeed, she did not have the required green card. She worried, saying to me, "How will I get it? I've heard if I have a police case," she's referring to the CPS case, "then you can't get a green card." So she didn't apply in part out of fear that this police case was going to create a problem. In addition to this trouble with immigration services, the CPS case threatened to reverberate to their housing and might almost lead to eviction. 6 months after the case, Honoria's caseworker reported, explaining to me that her landlord had been contacting the caseworker, wanting her out of the apartment. Although he formally took issue with the upkeep of the apartment, citing the smell of her food, the caseworker suspected that it was really because the landlord had heard about the CPS case. Indeed, work on eviction, like Matthew Desmond's, shows that CPS cases can be a real key reason for evictions. So here we see how a problem in one institution spread, creating new problems across institutions. So at the same time that institutional obstacles could create challenges, and obstacles that weren't overcome could block resources, families who were able to overcome obstacles gained access to key resources and had faced upward mobility. We found that cultural brokers could be a key resource in helping families to overcome these obstacles. In the book, we focus on cultural brokers as volunteers Although also there's a large literature on how children and especially adult children can play a role of brokers within immigrant families as they help families and particularly parents navigate different third-party agencies and institutions. Here we focus on these volunteers. Refugees who are resettled are often assigned volunteers upon arrival. This has been kind of formalized in under Biden's Welcome Corps program pretty recently, but there's also been a long-standing history of this in refugee resettlement as kind of a complementary support. So these volunteers were often, but upper middle class and professional native-born Americans, although in many organizations we also found immigrants who had been here for longer and refugees who wanted to help newcomers who were just arriving. Many of these volunteer groups were also associated with religious organizations and had a kind of religious basis. So these volunteers helped families by providing tutoring and helping to furnish apartments, buying a new washing machine, these kinds of things. But also we found they could play a really key role as institutional navigators, helping families prevent errors, overcome obstacles, and stopping these problems from spreading. So they played a really key role in families' upward mobility. For the Ngoma family, for instance, they arrived in the U.S. with their 5 children after over 19 years of living in a refugee camp in Tanzania. When the family arrived in the U.S., in addition to support from the Federal Refugee Resettlement Program, they were welcomed by a team of 40 faith-based volunteers, and these volunteers acted as cultural brokers, helping them navigate U.S. institutions. Diane, the head of the welcome team, reported spending at least 25 hours a week helping the family when they first arrived, sometimes clocking in 10 or 12-hour days. The volunteers gathered donations and helped subsidize the family's rent, contributing about $750 each month, which was about half of their rent. But crucially, where we really saw key sort of a boost from their help was in navigating these obstacles. So for instance, Joseph and Georgette both had jobs in a sort of packaging facility, think like Amazon and online orders. They worked in a factory where they put the item in the correct package and made sure the label was on it, ready to ship. This was a really common job for many of the families we met. So even with their jobs, the family of 7 qualified for government assistance, including about $700 in food benefits. So they'd, in many ways, joined the working poor in the US. While these food stamp benefits were really helpful, they also brought their own hurdles for the family. Indeed, the upper middle class white volunteers were shocked by the finicky procedures and requirements and complicated rules to actually using the food stamps. You couldn't buy cleaning supplies or paper products. Only certain things could go under food stamp account. Crucially, you had to recertify food stamps every 6 months. So to prove that you continued to be eligible, the family was sent a big manila envelope with forms that had to be completed with information about employment, documentation of pay stubs. And so normally Kathy, one of the volunteers, helped the family fill out the forms. Joseph would save their mail and she'd come by and they would check, and once the form arrived, they would complete it. However, one month when Georgette was out of work, facing a health crisis, they ran into a problem with the recertification. The family never received the forms in the mail. They just didn't come. When the forms didn't come, they didn't fill them out. However, a month or two later, they received a letter saying you've been cut off from your food stamps, right? There was no recertification submitted, so you're cut off. Crucially, nothing had changed in their employment. If anything, they needed the resources more as Georgette was out of a job. The issue was only that recertification form. So this error in the mail tangled the routine procedures, creating a complex blockage. To get the food stamps reinstated, they had to appeal the decision. Kathy, acting as a cultural broker, suggested this process and then helped the family navigate it using her English language, her knowledge of US systems, to overcome it. As she explained, I filled out the appeal and I mailed it in. Then we got a notice about a hearing, so I set up a hearing. Georgette and I went to the hearing. At the hearing, I explained that they never got the form. It could have been stolen from their mailbox, maybe because it looked valuable. I don't know what happened, but the judge just said it was fine. So she went to the appeal and made the case for the family, and it was approved. So Kathy played a key role as a cultural broker. Fluent in English and accustomed to American bureaucracy, she helped untie the knot. But it was still costly for the family. She winced explaining the fiasco. 2 months, it took 2 months. It was right at the time when they were still trying to recover from Georgette not having work. So it was really bad. It meant that they ended up putting more stuff on the credit card and completely depleting their savings. So this knot was deeply consequential for the family. The Ngomas lost their food assistance, which was about $700 a month. So here we see the cultural brokers played a key role, but without institutional change, it was just there were too many opportunities for things to go wrong. Even so, brokers were really key and helped the family make huge gains. This family, within 5 years, Joseph was conversational in English. Their teen boys had graduated from high school. Their daughter was on her way to a community college, and the family bought a home. So cultural brokers made a big difference. Even more helpful, however, were institutional insiders or people who worked within organizations, paid employees who were often at the face of different organizations. These people had valuable insider information and know-how that they could bring to helping overcome these obstacles. Additionally, sometimes they had the authority to override and untie a knot, overriding processes and give these kind of crucial bits of information. Of course, these frontline workers can also be discriminatory and hinder, and we certainly saw moments, often rooted in racism or xenophobia, where that happened. When these insiders were helpful, though, it made a key piece of difference, and this often was the case in particularly well-resourced organizations, schools that had more funding, for instance, where these frontline institutional insiders had the time and the willingness to help with these processes. So Elaine and Vanna, part of the Msafiri family, had help from institutional insiders when they sought to buy a house. So Elaine and his wife Vanna and their 8 children were resettled to the US after 16 years in the refugee camp. Like the other families, they had high hopes. Back home, Elaine had worked as a government bureaucrat and his wife had been a teacher. And then they both found jobs back in the refugee camp. When they arrived to the US, Vanna applied and got a job in a meat packing factory, as she said, cutting cows for 42 hours a week for $13. Elaine got a job working at the slicing machine in a bread factory for $10. They sequenced it so Vanna worked during the day and Elaine worked at night so that somebody could always be home to watch the children. So through their hard work, they saved up money each month, scrimping, saving most of Vanna's income in the hopes of buying a house. However, they quickly realized that buying a house was not just about financial savings, but also about navigating institutions. So, in their journey to buy a house, they had to go through 10 different institutions, banks, different real estate organizations, and all of these different home programs. A key piece of this was the mortgage pre-approval process, which Elaine described as the most complicated obstacle the family had faced yet. So unlike the Ngomas, they did not have a team of volunteers to act as cultural brokers, and they depended on agents working inside financial institutions. Crucially, Elaine and Vanna attended a home buying program for first-time buyers. This was a public government program, and their caseworker connected them and suggested the program. Even after they went through the program, then they still had to complete the additional pre-approval step. The family, Elaine and Vanna, prepared all of the documents, used the information they had learned in the home buying program, submitted to a bank, and however, the first two times, both times, their application was rejected. First, they realized they needed to file tax returns for up to 3 years consecutively, and during the first attempt, they hadn't met that. They had gone through this extensive program, and nobody had told them this crucial piece of information. The bank officer gave them information and told them to apply again. When they applied the next time, however, Elaine found out his credit score wasn't good. He discovered that there were some parking tickets he hadn't paid, and so the agents told him to apply again, but use his wife's credit score, and that could maybe help them. Again, so you had this institutional insider giving them crucial coaching advice. It wasn't until their third attempt that they were successful. So here they went back to the bank program that ran the home program. So they made an appointment and met with the official who had led that program. They sat down with him and submitted their application. And instead of just making a decision right then and there, he flipped through page by page, checking that each form was filled out correctly. He corrected some errors alongside with them, and advised them on how to finish up the application. With the help from this institutional insider, their attempt was approved, this application. So they were approved for about $200,000. Upon arriving home, Elaine and his family danced around in the kitchen with happiness and eventually bought a house, which was a dream come true for them in the US. So again, we had institutional insiders that played a key role in helping overcome these obstacles. So to sum up, in understanding how refugee families, along with immigrant and newcomer families, are due once they arrive in the US, it's really important to look at the context of reception and to understand how institutions determine the rules of the game by the different kind of obstacles and hurdles they set up, as long as as well as the embedded resources they have to overcome and reduce these obstacles. So here we found that it was really key that these sort of institutional processes, these obstacles and resources made a huge difference in what resources refugee newcomer families were able to access. Those families who struggled to overcome obstacles found their socioeconomic trajectories and their hopes and dreams of getting ahead to be stalled and sometimes derailed. families who had support from cultural brokers, from institutional insiders, and from this kinds of institutions that made those resources more likely. Those families got ahead. They sent their children to college. They bought houses. These were all goals that they stated and hoped and dreamed for. So here we hope to show that these institutional processes and mechanisms are really key. And in particular, we also argue that we encourage scholars to really take seriously how families sit at the nexus of a wide range of institutions and how families navigate all of these institutions all at once. So, looking just at education or at housing in isolation, scholars might underestimate the amount of obstacles that families face. And so we show how these obstacles can intersect and reverberate. Um, so we see these as deeply rooted in how systems are designed. And so we hope that these findings can also help improve the design of institutions so that refugee newcomers and others can succeed. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Blair, for that brilliant talk. I will hand it over to Ellen for some comments, maybe 10 minutes. Blair, I'll then ask if you want to respond to anything that sort of jumps out at you, and then we'll open it up to the audience for any questions.
Great, thank you.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me, everyone. And thank you, Blair, actually, for being so patient with me this year, because I've been meaning to give you commentary on this wonderful book for so long, and you've been patient with me as well. So I'm glad to have that chance today. I think this is a really brilliantly written and crafted book. And I can't really speak to the whole book because there's so much in it. But I wanted to point out, I think, at least 5 or 6 contributions that the book makes that are useful for our work as scholars, the process of doing research, but also for the field at large. One of them, and maybe this is kind of simple, but I think this is one of the first in-depth studies of Congolese refugees in the US that I have seen published in our immigration scholarship, at least in the US. We have seen growing attention to Black migration flows coming from both the Caribbean and Africa over the past several decades. They've tackled, the studies in that literature have tackled a lot of key questions. Both I'm thinking, questions about the imperial, colonial, neocolonial roots of those migration flows, but also key questions about how they fit in, right? How they're treated here in the US, given our particular racial history and hierarchy here. And so I think that scholarship is moving us forward now in terms of thinking about how Black migration flows are contributing to and transforming and changing our understandings of American life and certainly of Black community life here in America. But, it really is the case that we don't cover all of those subgroups within it yet, certainly not from Africa. And I'll give some figures from the book. Sackett and Lareau explained that during the First and Second Congo Wars, which took place between 1996 and 97, and then again between 1998 and 2003, just listen to this, more than 5.4 million people were killed and 2 million other people displaced. And they write that these figures were higher at that time than any other conflict since World War II. Right. So if we just kind of take those figures in, right, we don't have a lot of research, certainly in the American migration scholarship, like not only on this group, but just enough on kind of African migrants here, period. So they move on, they're kind of situating this book between 2014 and 22. Some of these refugees from the DRC, again, were among the top nationality group resettled as refugees here in the US. Again, I just think there's a big gap between the literature we have and the actual numbers and kind of scale here that I want to point out, and that leaves a lot of room for future work to join in. I did just kind of take a quick look at, Department of Homeland Security flow data today, and it is true, right? Between 2013 and 22, the Burmese and the Congolese are the top two refugee groups resettled. Over 78,000 DRC refugees here in the US alone in that period. And in recent years, that I was only able to follow the data up through 2022 here, they constituted a full quarter of all refugees settled here in 2020, 43% of them in 2021, 43%, and 30% in 2022. There actually are kind of additional numbers of legal permanent residents coming in from the Congo too. But I mean, again, I think all of this just to say, I mean, this is a really, really large group. It's a really important group. And so I think if nothing else, other than to just do a case study on them and bring them to light and insert them, more fully into our whole literature, that's a contribution in and of itself. But of course, the book, I think, goes on to make novel, theoretical, contributions as well. So I'd like to point a couple of those out. And one of them, I think, in my opinion, the big thing they do here is to illuminate what I would call a patterned systemic failure set up by our inadequately supported refugee system, right? Not just worldwide, but certainly here in the US, right? That only something like 1 to 2% of all refugees are even resettled in the first place to countries in the West. I mean, that is abysmal. Um, there are both kind of refugee and LPR arrivals coming from the DRC, and this book only focuses on one group of them, refugees, but that's theoretically interesting because they're set up to be a best case scenario in some ways, if you think about it, right? They're among these sort of, if I'm going to use this in quotes, right? The privileged few that are accepted by the international refugee resettlement agencies and resettled here with kind of the promise that they will be supported, and they're supported somewhat officially at this kind of broad level and framing. But if you look down at more of a meso level at the institutions that actually carry out that work, what Sackett and Lareau are doing is showing that that system fails. It fails to live up to its promise, and it doesn't live up to its promise really by design. So, maybe I'd even walk back a little bit. The book it's interesting. We're in kind of a moment in the literature where we're turning away from more traditional labor migration scholarship, labor migration and other forms of maybe professional migration scholarship. And you see the literature kind of moving now towards a focus on refugees, forced migration, integration, and on the other hand, moving towards new forms and systems of temporary non-immigrant mobility as well, both throughout the world and here in the US, right? Kind of scholars writing about the return of the Bracero era, if you will, right? So I think, to kind of be part of that term, to focus on a group that is arguably one of the largest refugee groups and has not received a lot of attention so far, and to bring in concepts from kind of older labor migration kind of theory and research to illuminate ways in which the national and international context of reception is not carried out systemically at the meso and micro levels, I think is very helpful. It's a big contribution. I think a third contribution of the book, and Blair's already made this point, but I think it deserves repeating, is that it models kind of the mechanisms of both migrant and refugee integration, if we think broadly about those terms, right? People debate the legal fictions of who gets to qualify as a refugee versus migrant. It does it across multiple institutions at the same time. And that's a key point of the book. We have a lot of case studies in immigrant incorporation processes, right? In the workplace, in a specific workplace or a couple of workplaces, or in schools, in a couple of schools, in the field of kind of criminal justice or in policing, even in politics, even in healthcare, right? But we don't focus, we don't think broadly again about what you've just heard now, how these institutions intersect with each other, how they require people that come to them and come through them to walk across different institutions, right? You kind of do this in your everyday lives. You have to get a paper here and take it there, and then you sign here and then go here. And it's these things aren't equal. They're not equally set up. And as I was reading this book and kind of thinking about this point, I'm like, oh yeah, this is a really good point. And um, it made me feel comforted in a way. About a decade ago, I published an article called Immigrant Bureaucratic Incorporation, which I was studying mostly undocumented immigrants, but some with legal status as well. Very few refugees, I don't think. And I was trying to think about kind of the differences and commonalities in incorporation or exclusion across workplaces versus schools versus policing versus politics. And I was proud of what I had published, but afterwards I immediately started thinking like, have I sacrificed depth for breadth, right? You know, when you start kind of playing at this level where you're comparing across institutions and finding patterns and which ones are tilting more service oriented, which ones are tilting more regulatory, I immediately started regretting that I couldn't go down into more detail within each specific one. Well, what about different types of workplaces? And what about different areas of schools, elementary schools versus high schools? Or what about the ESL programs versus kind of larger classes? And what about libraries? Or I couldn't go into different kinds of healthcare institutions, which I eventually tried to do. And I immediately thought, I think I've missed a lot of the depth for the breadth. And this is all of a sudden kind of this book is coming out and saying, wait, but the breadth is important. And actually they kind of pushing it even further. It's not just that the breadth is important, but we need to think of it as a system, as an interrelated system that is completely kind of unorganized in a way. It's not sort of set up to help people kind of navigate the intricacies across all of the institutions at the same time. So I think it's really important for part of the argument of my book long ago was that we can think about context of reception in, certainly that core concept has always been very important for me, that national policies and laws matter to how people are received and do, and also that local economy matters and the size of the co-ethnic community and their resources matter. Those three things are really big, but I always thought we could go further, right? We could specify other elements of context of reception. And one of them is all the other kinds of bureaucracies, again, that kind of matter at that meso level. And we may even think about not just the size and resources of a co-ethnic community. What about the non-co-ethnic community? We can think about public opinion more broadly. Oops, sorry. It's now you have all the technology and phones that link to your computers, and they create errors and reverberate. But I think in this book, Sackett and Lareau really make a case for us that we need to think about bureaucracies at this meso level as part of the wider context of reception that really matters to how people are received and how they fare. Very quickly, I might have mentioned a little bit of this. I think a fourth contribution is, again, kind of differentiating between official welcoming policies, maybe at a national level, official framings, right, as deserving and supported, and the actual unofficial practices and behaviors that happen on the ground. Again, kind of the Congolese are arguably near a best case scenario group, not in all ways. There's one point in the book where the authors mentioned they're mostly Christian, right? And so we know our refugee policy follows domestic policy, right? And they're kind of set up to be received well, if you will, but they don't encounter this kind of welcoming from these bureaucratic institutions, which I think kind of basically engage in what the public service research calls bureaucratic disenfranchisement, right? You don't have to be disenfranchised just by a negative turn in public opinion or an elite immigration entrepreneur who spouts, hatred and restriction. It doesn't even have to happen by kind of an uptick in policing, right? It can happen through these kind of more banal everyday operations of the bureaucracies, right? The errors that keep people from getting services to which they are legally entitled and to which maybe a national frame says that it supports. I think the final kind of substantive contribution that I take away from this, and that I think will link to a lot of newer projects and literatures that people are working on, is the more positive and incorporative role of both the helpful institutional insiders within the bureaucracies, like the various, we've all been to a place where we kind of need help. We need to find someone who gets us through that system, but also external brokers and cultural volunteers too. And I was immediately reminded when I was reading this, these people are powerful, but they're not full substitutes, right, for bureaucratic hurdles, bureaucratic exclusion, restriction. They can do a lot of things. I remember in my own research, people sort of didn't believe me at the time. I'm like, there's all these people actually trying to help undocumented immigrants get through this system and do this thing. And sometimes they all know each other, right? I remember one lady who was married to a judge and would talk to him and get something happen within that system. And then they'd go and they walk over to the school and do that, help pay a parking ticket, right? They're there. I think a lot of them are maybe white professional women. So there's, a conversation we can have about positionality with that too. Not always, but these institutional insiders matter. The cultural brokers and volunteers matter too. They remind me of research on the value of mentors and education, just how powerful mentors are. They remind me of Patricia Fernandez Kelly's work on the truly significant others that are truly significant in the lives of children of immigrants. So again, I think we can tie this to, research on brokerage and research on both public and private volunteers who help people get through otherwise kind of disenfranchising systems. But again, recognizing, right, that individual agency doesn't always have power over kind of larger restrictive systems. And I just, I'll take 2 more minutes. The appendices are really useful. I was rereading this book. I'll just kind of throw a plug out there for those of you who have read the book or maybe want to use it again. I was rereading it this week and I found myself reading the introduction and then going to the appendices first before I cycled back again. And that's not what I had done the first time around, but I highly encourage you to check out, there's Appendix A, Appendix B, and Appendix C. And the value to me of Appendix A is that very clearly Sackett and Lareau lay out a table for you, not just of their respondents, but of the various kinds of institutions they encounter and examples, very clear, succinct examples of ways in which their respondents interact with those institutions and the kinds of hurdles and knots, right, that they encounter within them. So it's a great kind of cheat sheet. It's a great way to kind of organize and see this and map it out very clearly. I sort of wondered if the institutional arena of taxation, right, was kind of maybe more deserving of being in there. In Appendix C, we learn about, mainly from Sackett, kind of lead author on the book, about the fits and starts of actually doing research, right, which we don't talk a lot about, but are always really interesting conversations. You'll learn about the challenges of doing research with a highly vulnerable group that has experienced a lot of trauma, the kind of thoughtful ethics that need to go into that kind of project. You'll learn about doing research in another language, doing research in the middle of facing roadblocks by a global pandemic that cuts off ethnography and in-person interviewing, even collaboration with your co-author. Learn about doing research amidst personal family emergencies, other things that happen in one's own life as a researcher. And I think was interesting, kind of, you learn about trying to do the sort of deep, qualitative, ethnographic, longitudinal work when kind of publishers and funding agencies are always kind of constantly pushing us to get more data and to get more, arguably representative data, kind of how you navigate, right, the value of the deeper kind of ethnography with those kinds of pushes, which I've felt, in my own projects recently. Within that Appendix C too, I, Blair mentioned it kind of earlier when talking, but there's an interesting conversation to be continued here about the role of positionality. And Sackett and Lareau don't deny the roles of, let's say, race and nativity and citizenship in creating different kinds of power differentials, of course. But I did note that, their key kind of argument in this appendix is that it's really the difference between doing sustained ethnography, right? Kind of spending more time with people, developing deeper relationships, which really is what affected the quality of their data. And that was kind of something different than what they got with sort of more cautious, less trustful, maybe thinner data just from more one-off interviews. And that might be useful to, other graduate students and junior faculty kind of thinking about what type of work to do and how to create those relations in the field. And Appendix B, it's a very useful, great, useful, succinct primer to the various scholarly literatures that inform this book, of which there are many. And I particularly like that Sackett and Lareau bring our attention back to the concepts of field and cultural capital, and they really bring them into conversations about immigration enforcement, refugee resettlement, and immigrant incorporation. Um, if I had to say anything, you can probably tell that I really like this book and that it's, a little difficult for me to come up with any major critiques. I might say, I kept thinking of taxation and insurance, the whole time. So maybe kind of dialoguing with the new work on immigration and taxation. I think Amada Armenta is doing a little creative work here. I saw that you cited Assad's book early on. And, I was thinking as I went through this book, he's been writing this work on how undocumented immigrants either system avoid, right? They avoid these kinds of institutions, both immigration enforcement, but also everyday bureaucratic, forms of surveillance, and sort of mapping out how undocumented immigrants selectively engage with at different times and under different conditions versus avoid. I wonder how you see the refugees in comparison, right? Maybe just by definition, they can't avoid, right? They're more embedded, but they may become distrustful. We may teach them to become distrustful, to avoid and disengage selectively at some times. And I guess finally, it reminds me of the chilling effects literature. I think you're effectively speaking to the literature in social welfare and on healthcare and what's called chilling effects. How policies of restriction and how policing um, keep people who are otherwise entitled from certain services from getting them. But I think that you illuminate another mechanism through which chilling effects occur. And again, that's through these banal everyday forms of bureaucratic disenfranchisement. So I think it's a really great book.
Thanks so much, Helen, for those comments. Blair, do you want to address any of those? We also have a few questions in the chat that I can read out to you, so we can proceed with the last 15 minutes as you feel most comfortable. Yeah.
Sure. I'll just say really quick, Helen, thank you so much for those extremely kind comments. It was a joy to see the work through your sort of lens, and Helen's work has been like super inspirational in our conceptualization of these sort of bureaucratic navigational obstacles and looking across institutions. So I really appreciate that. I think I'll just touch a little bit on your sort of final point, which I didn't bring up too much or I guess second to last point in the presentation, although I think is a really interesting question. How different kinds of immigrants, right? I sort of set this up as refugees as a certain type of migrant that has a very distinctive migration pathway and therefore context of reception. And so how do these findings apply or not for other kinds of immigrants who might have different contexts of reception? Of course, we, are limited by our data in exactly kind of what we could claim, but in many ways, I think we saw this as really what Helen mentioned as a sort of, in some ways, best case scenario, right? Where refugees, even if we're sort of arguing that refugees in many ways don't have as welcoming of a welcome as they might have on paper in reality. Even so, we suspect that in many ways that sort of refugee migration status is sort of a more positive. It means you have access to these different institutions. So on the one hand, that might mean that there are more hurdles because you're seeking out more services. Um, but we think that these apply likely to other kinds of immigrants and asylum seekers as well, and might even be more severe with other kinds of immigrants. I think that's something that would love to hear from other folks what they're finding. So that's something, I think could be exciting to learn more about too. So thank you so much.
Blair, there are a few questions. I might cluster
Yeah.
3 of them. There's our first set of questions. There are 2 that are related to methods. For the sake of time, and because of how thorough the methodological appendix is, I might just skip over those. But
Okay.
there are 2 questions that I'm reading here about differences in experiences and or relationships between Congolese refugees once in the US based on ethnic background or regional background. And then a second question was on differences by race and gender, since you mentioned that some of these things, the knots and the hurdles, are not neutral. So that sort of
Yeah.
stratification, yeah.
Yeah. So great. Let's see. Yeah, so the first question is really, I think, hits on an important question about variation within this Congolese group. And in many ways, I talked about Congolese newcomers as sort of a, one group. I think in the book, we do go a little bit more in depth about different distinctions on their own backgrounds and experiences. But a key piece here is that many of the Congolese refugees came from different ethnic groups back home, and in some cases from ethnic groups that were on opposing sides of the war and conflict. And so this played out, Elaine and Vanna, for instance, were a sort of inter-ethnic love marriage and fled war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When in their region, there were roadblocks set up for both ethnic groups. And so if you were a member of the other ethnic group, you could be detained or killed if you went through the roadblock. So this inter-ethnic marriage put them at risk, and so they fled ultimately because of that. Within the US, this often meant that sometimes refugee resettlement agencies tried to create social networks or community support with newcomer Congolese. And sort of an important piece here was this was a very new group that was arriving. So it wasn't the case that the Congolese refugees came to sort of a robust ethnic enclave really anywhere in the US. So in many ways, they were kind of creating these new communities. Now there are some larger communities in like Louisville and Lexington, Kentucky, Dayton, Ohio. But sometimes caseworkers wouldn't understand necessarily that there were these sort of ethnic tensions and resettle. Honoria and Malu Malu actually they were neighbors, and the resettlement agency had put them close by in the hopes that they would help each other out. But they were actually part of opposing ethnic groups. And so the relationship was a little bit more fraught because of this long-standing history, right? If you think about, being resettled and then assuming you're gonna, be best friends with a Trump supporter and a Democrat, you can imagine there's sort of political divides and social orientations that people bring with them that were not always recognized by outsiders, but were really salient for those within the community. And then the other sort of question I think hits at how Congolese refugees are racialized. They were racialized as Black in the US and faced a lot of discrimination. And the question is really getting at how these hurdles and knots are not neutral and how they're unequal. There's some excellent work by Pam Hurd and Don Moynihan on administrative burdens, and then they wrote a piece with Victor Ray, really looking at how the kinds of ways that these systems burden and use up time and create stress are unequal across US society. So of course here we're looking at one group and we were, limited in how we could document, any sort of quantification across different groups. But they really show that particularly for people of color and people who are facing poverty, they're often interacting, the kinds of institutions they interact with are those that have more of these burdens, that have more of the obstacles we're talking about. So this came up, for example, the Ngoma family was resettled by this group of volunteers, and they were resettled to a wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood right by this volunteer group. They eventually had to move because rent was too high, but because the US is so unequal in geographical distribution, this also meant that they were interacting with extremely well-resourced schools. So their son had a full-time aide that went to classes with him and made sure everything was, all the forms were filled out, he was understanding things. So this is sort of, he had this built-in institutional insider that provided slack to overcome obstacles. So you could see that families who were resettled into more low-income communities in Philly, there was really nobody providing that kind of role. So that's kind of one example of how the resources were unequal and how these sort of obstacles and ways to overcome them were unequal in the US.
Thank you. And I'll read just in the last 5 minutes that we have here another set of questions about agencies. Are there some agencies more well suited to help refugees than others? Could they act as institutional norm entrepreneurs? And the second question, could you talk a little bit more about refugee networks slash organizations and helping navigate hurdles?
Mhm. Yeah, those are great questions. So, one of the challenges that was common across many institutions was that refugees faced, they have like a very distinctive legal status. And so many institutions didn't understand the specific bureaucratic rules and entitlements that refugees had. So, for instance, recently resettled refugees are able to qualify for welfare assistance, even if they don't fit some of the requirements maybe a native-born American would have to clear. And so many times, welfare institutional caseworkers didn't know these rules. So refugee families and the caseworkers helping them were having to teach different institutions the actual rules for what they qualified. This happened at the DMV and really across countless different organizations. I think that in some instances, this kind of shows why refugee resettlement workers and agencies are so important. And so part of what we talk about in the conclusion of the book is recommendations on really how to improve systems. And of course, we would advocate for streamlined systems with more universal access to income or to assistance, which didn't have all of these cumbersome requirements to prove deservingness. In lieu of that, case workers played a super crucial role. The issue was often that the caseworker role ended after about 90 days. And so families were at that point kind of left to figure it out on their own, which is very, very quick, particularly when you're navigating like this countless amount of institutions, right? So maybe families had figured out how to pay for utilities and their rent, but then navigating the US school system, or as Helen brought up, insurance. Actually, health insurance was a common sort of institution that families didn't needed assistance with how to understand and navigate. So I think, increasing the amount of assistance from resettlement workers and sort of extending the amount of time they have to help families would make a really big difference.
Thank you for that. I might just ask one last question. As people read this book, as they walk away from this talk, what is one thing that maybe you hope people take away from the work outside of the theoretical frames and all the methodological tips and tricks? Is there anything that you're hoping people will take away from We Thought It Would Be Heaven?
Yeah. So I think one of the key things that we really hope people will take away is that how little things, seemingly little things, can become really big things. And so I sort of mentioned, right, one form, right, this stack of this manila envelope for food stamp recertification was the difference between hundreds of dollars for this family. It was the difference between them depleting their savings when they arrived. And this was across countless institutions. And so I think a lot of newcomers encountered from really everyone around them the idea that they should just be able to do these seemingly easy tasks and what was taking so long. And so this idea, I think we really wanted to help people understand that these systems, as Helen put it so well, are set up in a way that really systematically fail these families and really a lot of families across America as well. And so I think just really understanding how these seemingly little things make a big difference, but also how those little things are really rooted in the larger system and the larger sort of set of US institutions that we've set up. And they sort of set people up to fail. But also that there are things we can do. And so we really worked hard to include, positive things and resources that really do help. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Blair. And thanks also, Helen, for joining us today. If we can give them a round of applause. I really appreciate you being here. And for folks in the audience, we'll continue our virtual book talk series across Berkeley, UCLA, and San Diego migration centers. So join one or all of the listservs. Keep coming around. We appreciate you engaging in community with us. Thank you all. Happy Friday. Thanks again, Blair.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
Helen.
Helen, thank you so much for your comments. I just wanted to say, I'm glad this worked out. Stephanie, I don't know I can't remember if I wrote this in the email, but Helen and we had tried to schedule a panel that Helen was going to be discussing on, and with scheduling, it didn't work out. So this was it was really amazing.
Yeah, it didn't work out multiple times. And I was thinking appendix. I'm like, I don't even
I'm
know
glad
that.
I caught you both at your vulnerable moments and made this happen. I appreciate you both being here. I'm going to send, it's a very small token, but just a $50 Visa gift card to you both for your time. I can't, without getting all of the bureaucratic people involved, send more than that, but I'll just send that over very quickly. But thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. And I was taking notes the whole time you were talking, Helen. Thanks so much.
Well, it's great to meet you. I'm familiar with you. We've never actually met, so thank you for organizing this.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. All right, let me know if anything comes up and if I can be of support in any of the work you're all doing.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.